I think another thing that I'm interested in is building models that are steering people towards good allostasis and co-regulation and the modeling as such.
Welcome back to the discussion series for DigiNEST, Digital Narratives and Emerging Story Technologies. I'm Jess Parent. This is episode 12. DigiNEST is a reading group and research program at JOPRO that asks how new tools, technologies, and interfaces are changing authorship, agency, and participation. We read across scholarship and practice, test ideas with prototypes, and try to surface patterns that help builders create humane, non-extractive narrative spaces. In this episode, it's myself and program co-lead and co-host Avery Lim. Avery will walk us through several projects they've been prototyping within the program, including a multi-agent system exploring what they call chiral empathy, a retrieval augmented generation tool built around intersectionality, co-regulation, and allostasis, and a life organization assistant grounded in neurodivergence-aware productivity literature. We also get into some of the bigger questions about what it means to craft intentional AI agents versus just interacting with general purpose models, the differences between an agent that delivers outcomes and one that makes its regulatory reasoning transparent, and how personality vectors in large language models might reveal structural patterns worth mapping. If you want more background on DigiNEST, including some of the papers we've been reading, like the Reflective Agency paper at the MIT Media Lab, check out our recent posts on the JOPRO Substack. We also get into some of the background about broader aims of the program and where we're headed next. But for today's discussion, let's get into it. Let's start this by saying, hey, Avery, tell somebody who has no idea about DigiNEST or what your interests are. Give a little primer before we even get into the projects. What is Avery doing and why? Why do you care about it?
I'm interested in queer, neurodivergent, and intersectional tools and potential ways that technology can be structured around that and utilize information around that for compassionate injustice, especially for I'm particularly interested in ways that it can aid people in their own personal processing about such. Additionally, I think it'll become clear that there's not particular ways of doing things right now. But additionally, I want to look into different notions of chirality and symmetry and qualia, cognition, relational patterns, and information structures, and try to utilize that to look into potential technology stacks that are trying to map out those spaces in both in the large data sets we currently have and in the potential ways we can gather and utilize data in the future.
I would supplement that by saying one of the first things Avery and I worked on a long time ago in orthogonal lab was the idea of allostatic kinds and these different ways of much more nuanced ways of individuals having regulatory proclivities or regulatory biases or regulatory preferences and how they're processing information or how they're processing different stimuli in the environment. Understanding that at a human level, there may be differences, or at an agent level, there may be differences in how these things are happening, not just like phenotypical expressions, but like the individual terrain and regulatory space may have uniqueness as well. And then that was kind of a few years ago. And then everything that Avery just said now with regulation.
I think it'll make more sense when I talk about specific
Of
projects.
course. So let's go and let's move to that now.
Project number one is what I call the chiral empathy project. It basically means making a multi-agent system that. So unfortunately, the personality systems that actually do have notions about symmetry, interpersonal lopsidedness, particular reactive structures towards the environment are less or straight up not empirically found. I suspect that has more to do with the lack of the difficulty in measuring such when it's so context dependent and or not robustly philosophically
Yeah.
defined
Yeah.
in terms of what's measuring. And I want to do, but yeah, kind of is a chance for me to both learn skills and also see what it would be like to have an AI agent that's made to evaluate like lopsidedness and respond in a complementary manner. I don't think there is an AI bot that's focused on doing that, to my knowledge. My other two projects I'm working on right now are RAGs. One is a like emotional processing one that's focused on basically two principles of intersectionality and co-regulation and allostasis. Another one that I'm currently trying, the principles include allostasis and co-regulation, trying to involve notions of like what evaluating what's regulating for you, how do you concretely complete the process of sort of an embodied integration of experiences. Secondly, I'm interested in intersectionality, articulating the different power structures impact you. And thirdly, I'm interested in the notion of relational autonomy, being able to properly label and hold to account different impacts that systems and individuals have on you. So I've collected a lot of different books to serve as or to help a chatbot respond with a lot of nuance on those different topics. I've tagged the different books in different categories and have subcategories for the different chunks I've broken it down to further get into. I have 25 different small subtopics that some of the chunks automatically get fed into, and those get pulled up when they're detected within an expanded query.
Yeah, I think this is about this one and not the next one. But you're basically, when you're prototyping and testing and playing around with it, you're saying like, okay, this is a lot more tailored than current large scale language models, because you are able to get the model to produce a little bit more, or even maybe a lot more of the context that you're aiming for. So there is a way to kind of get at the specific.
I think a lot of what you and I have talked about, a shared theme in it is the idea that matters where and how information is obtained and how it's impacting people. And yeah, getting a bunch of things from people who are experts in marginalized people or co-regulation. There's a lot more specific domain knowledge about that. I'm very interested when it is purposefully encouraged to combine those different perspectives that basically survey the power structures and regulatory constraints of your life and combine that into a clear and source reference for you.
There's a lot to be said there, because we, outside of Avery's particular projects and prototyping for what they're looking at here, and DigiNEST recently looked at the persona drift paper from Anthropic, the assistant personality type, the different personalities or ways of handling things that AI assistants can have. We're looking at a lot of things from the MIT Media Lab and the AHA group and the fluid interface and cyber psychology. And it's very interesting to kind of see this emerging space of how are people crafting to get the mix between what are the actual means by which a technology can present a favorable lens or a favorable space or a favorable discussion space, and then what is the actual process of selecting the materials that will let it do that. And I think there's, in some of my other work outside of DigiNEST proper, there's quite a broad tension between like the big tech AI labs and their hyper general models that are very capable, and the big tech bets, as I'm calling it, of seeing where those models are going, but then these the sort of ground up, very niche, very tailored tuning or tweaking or training of a model towards a specific set of things, and what is the sort of interplay between those two poles for what you need in terms of tailoring or making bespoke or having specific use cases. So I think for someone who's theoretically invested in like making own ideas as Avery is, like, I'm very curious where you're going to go with
I think
these outcomes.
I think it'd be interesting to write a paper about phenomenology and stuff from Foucault and Rob Benjamin about data subjectivity and the importance of data that specifically articulate different points of perspective that impact people's lives in terms of power, autonomy, and well-being. The importance of both how you source data and where you source it, and also specifically utilizing that in the structure of what AI is specifically referencing, such that it is actively modeling or close to modeling, at least referencing specific information about the societal and personal life structures that impact someone.
Yeah.
And what people's life experiences are like for people like that person is.
Yeah.
And it's quite interesting because it's part of the DigiNEST community, the broader JOPRO community of mental health paradigms and perspectives. We have Jen, a current Bachelor of Social Work student. And it's very interesting to see like the concept of unknowing as a fundamental thing that social workers are trained on, and how even in one part of their training, they were exposed to a GTP, an LLM agent that was supposed to simulate certain discussions of like how to get information from them and so on. So you have the technology there too, but also just like many of the things that I've been looking at and posting about as its related discussions have been the amount of what properties or what features is an agent doing? Are they being sycophantic? Are they being encouraging? Are they being quote unquote honest? One of the discussions we most recently had with Molly last time when she was in our previous DigiNEST group meeting was about how are we even defining honesty? So all of these sort of things about what kind of, for lack of better terms, rigor and maybe philosophical rigor, but also rigor in terms of understanding actual intrapersonal spaces and how LLMs have very, very insightful things. And then also the understanding that they may not necessarily know what they're saying. But if you give them the right material and tell them the right way to approach it, what they generate and present you with can very much hit the mark in particular ways.
I think another thing that I'm interested in is specifically like building models that are steering people towards good allostasis and co-regulation and the modeling as such. And there's probably projects that do that, but I'm not aware of them right now. And I'm interested to see more of that and to implement my own version of that. Because I think that like it feels very different when an agent is specifically built to directly talk about constraints and common issues in self and co-regulation. And when it's actively modeling such
Right.
versus when it's like implementing a particular technique.
I think that that's super interesting to see the degrees of quality training or development of these models and these tools. Because even from the point of view of having a human being trained to be clinical therapists to other human beings, what and how much in a sort of utopian way, you can see where, oh, if you could find ways to do this for an AI that was aware of things, the training process could potentially be much better. I had a conversation about this exact same thing a few days ago regarding the difficulty of some of the trainees in the social work program of understanding that one of their primary tasks, in my view, this is Jesse's thing, this isn't certified training, this is the NSW, this is Jesse's personal ideas about things. In my view, the primary thing that you should be doing right away is when you're meeting a client or talking to somebody or engaging somebody is, yes, building rapport, but also collecting data and collecting sort of leads on data, leads on what they are, how they think, all these things. And there's sort of a template in my mind of not that it has to be set in stone in terms of what somebody is, but you have sort of a model. I'm trying to find the best words for it, but it's essentially outside of the session, outside of getting to know the client. I think a primary goal as any kind of a guide, whether you're a paid social worker, which was as a social worker is supposed to do specific things and other things. But if you are a sincere guide in someone's development, whatever form that takes, you must, in my mind, have a very clear drive to understand the entire possible space of what a human being is. You have to know intimately that space and know that you're incomplete and always trying to learn, always trying to improve your sort of macro model of potential experiences, right? And then as when you meet a client, your goal is to collect data to understand that the person you're talking to may be an unreliable narrator. They may be culturally conditioned to speak about things a certain way. They may be uninformed about like intergenerational trauma. They may not know a lot of things that are going on. So your goal is to carefully engage with them, do the detective work, and build out this model given your broad experiential inquisitions before, you build out a model of what is this person? Like, and to me, that's something that is not as simple as, oh, here's a template for how to do that. But there's very clear things that you should be doing in the process of trying to understand what is going on for this person. How do they work? How do they regulate? All these different mechanistic things, regulatory things. And so that's a human learning how to do other humans. What's interesting, what's intriguing about a lot of the work that you're trying to do and you're trying to get into and that we talk about all the time is that, yes, I think taking some of the theoretical nuggets, taking some of the insights that are bridging from things that are theoretically experimental, but rigorous, and moving on from the pseudoscience of certain personality typologies or other ways of understanding how people are towards these functional, more robust, more holistic agents or systems or models that are trained with a lot of the stuff that just is present. It's not as simple as like, oh, I'm going to upload the cultural competency module and we're going to attach on this extension. And now our super AI therapist is going to be totally culture competent. It's not at that level, but I think there are movements towards how do we create literacy, or in my sense, the language models artifacts for, this space that clearly has a lot more that can be refined and made available than what currently exists in those spaces.
Yeah, and I'm interested in both doing that and like having it integrated across. Like, I think a big thing for me is that like I want agents to like take different evaluations of embeddedness in particular environments and the dynamics and constraints there, and like integrate that into a singular addressing of a person they're dealing with, and ways to tool themselves and deal with it. But yeah, in terms of the third thing, it's pretty similar. It's just applied more towards life organization. So it's more focused on like I practice a lot of neurodivergence focused books, productivity books balanced by anti-ableist books. So there's a focus on like articulating these are different inclinations people can have and sensitivities they can have, and here are ways people can mobilize as well. And how can I balance that while also specifically still serving someone who can help like time block, make to-do lists with nuanced awareness of your limitations. What that entails.
So and I have sort of insider knowledge about this somewhat, but to speak about it in this way, is the first RAG project that you mentioned sort of, I don't want to say therapeutic, but more like help, like doing certain intrapersonal work around identity or around how someone's relating to themselves in the world in I don't know how you'd say.
The specific purpose of it so far has mostly been like, and what's particularly good at is like somatic grounding in the face of articulated acknowledgments of injustice and need. And I call it emotional RAG. I think it is focused on like relational and societal, what can you concretely do about that? And how can you be present in the here and now about that?
And the other one is a bit more operations oriented or logistics. Like how do you, as in neurodivergent sense? Yeah.
It's still like that. It has a good balance of like, here's how to mobilize, as well as about like, sometimes you can't mobilize, but it's rest, you're wasting rest.
So to zoom out for 1 second, which we do all the time, but to zoom out, it's almost like what you're doing kind of in practice is you're getting these experiences, but like what we're doing is sort of like you're doing some really, I would say, deep like playing with, experimenting with, prototyping with these, like not just like a chat bot as a thing that exists that you can talk to, but a much higher nuance or very specifically trained agent that you could interact with. Because it's not the agent is one thing, and I don't, and maybe I'm speaking for you here, but you can correct this. I don't see these agents as the things that what you're building is not the same as the kind of, to me, it feels very different than, say, someone who wants to get married to GTP 4.0 because they loved how much it was
I actually talked to my friend who used to use it a lot for that. And he was saying like, oh, you're really into it now, but you're gonna get bored. And I'm like, it actually interests me more to like craft it rather than use it.
Yeah. And I think there's different approaches to both, but what I'm getting at is like, I think one of the interesting things that you're doing is that it's not just it's a somewhat transactional thing. There's obviously positive reward that you're getting and you're feeling good after it. And you're pressing a button, getting a nice stimulus and response. Yes, I acknowledge that. But I think the interesting part of what's happening here is we're looking at how to do a very particularly, there's a lot of intention about the regulation that's happening here. And I think that's a core DigiNEST theme, like digital narratives, emerging story technologies. We talked about the reflection agency paper. We talked about what is agency? How do you preserve your sense of how to craft your narratives and what kind of conclusions are being met? Is there pressure on the conclusion spaces? Are you being led to draw, all those things? And in this specific case of what you're getting at, it's not just, hey, you're making a really nice chat GTP bot that talks in ways that you feel good about. There's sort of a personal element of, especially as a crafter and a creator, this is something where I will put a digital pin in this and say, let's drop in Kat Chang, who is doing work from the Plot Twisters camp, from Storytelling Cards camp, about working on these ways of generating mechanisms and tools that will help the intentional surfacing of how one's own core elements and reference points and landmarks in the development of one's identity and narrative and work she's doing. So we'll come back to that at some other point. But what we're getting at is not just like nice GTP chatbots, but in a creator or practitioner sense, you're building this tool that's tailored, and then you're doing this all in a very intentional way of, you're not just aiming for the right words to be said to you, you're aiming for this kind of regulatory process. I think that's the key word in my mind right now. You're aiming for this intentional selection of not just, I want an answer, it's, I want to see ways for me modeled that I can choose or select or try to ingrain more of how to do the regulatory work, of how I'm thinking about this internally in terms of my emotions, or how I'm thinking about this internally, how I'm acting in the world and taking these logistical operation productivity approaches as well. Like, how does that square for you?
I think I want this to be less of raw stimulation and more like actively being a pro-regulatory interaction that helps bring coherency. That's true. Yeah.
It's like an assistive, I'm going to say assistive technology, because that's very specific meanings in my former line of work around folks who are differently abled. But assistive in a,
Stable is not a bad word.
yeah, assisting in a transition of regulatory norms, and not just use the incentive of use the tool, like not just use the LM or pay for your subscription, but I think it's really interesting to consider the intent of moving from one regulatory or one identity feedback loop in the emotional sense to, okay, how do I, with a level, because you mentioned earlier, like, or maybe not in this conversation, previous conversation, what's appealing is sort of the transparency or the intentionality of what the model is commenting on and why, as opposed to just delivering an outcome. And by basically bringing you into that aspect of, here's how we're thinking about it, and here's how you can feel about it, or here's what you can do about it. It's bringing you along in a pro-regulatory sense, but like being very obvious, like, okay, we're taking the whole, it's not quite interpretability and explainability, but we're trying to create as much highlighting or the tracer fire, but we're trying to illuminate the alternatives or the transitional points as much as possible when you're trying to do these different things.
Yeah, the affordances, the regulatory.
Yeah, where can you shift? Where can you regulatorily shift
within power and relational structures?
Yeah,
and your particular body environment, right?
Yes, yeah. I think that's like absolutely in terms of like use social AI or the best uses of AI, the best uses of the technology we have there, I think that is really promising.
I
Oh
am
yeah, I
interested to
didn't I
say
didn't know
about
there was
that.
a fourth. Let's go to the fourth project.
So because of how the personality vectors worked, it made me wonder, like, can I map that onto like, and given I should probably write that as a first paper first, but like, I think I can distill down my shower thoughts about like phenomenology, qualia, and personality into a philosophical and mathematically representable formats. And I'm interested, like, to what extent, if I evaluate the vector spaces those personality vectors were found within, could I like identify axes? Could can I, and if those axes do exist, can I use that in interesting ways?
So when you're saying personality vectors and axes, are you referring to the Anthropic paper or are you referencing something?
Yeah,
Okay.
the Anthropic paper found that in those vector
Mm.
spaces, when you look at how particular responses, this is a not technical explanation, I'm still early,
Yeah,
I'll look
yeah.
into it. If you look at how particular responses are embedded, you find particular vectors and particular layers that get activated.
Mm.
And I'm wondering, like, do they form like polar? Do they polarize? Are there like for example, is the vector for like technical and expressive very different? Could I map it onto a collective unified framework within like one of the many different ideas I have for articulating chiral structures, it's asymmetrical lopsided structures within con information structures and interpersonal framework dynamics. I think it'd be interesting to identify, can you find polarized vector spaces within there, and what kind of structures do they do or do not have? If they don't have them, I'd be curious to still play around with it and see what relates. Is it just noise and random? If so, why is it random? Why wouldn't these seemingly opposite concepts not be found in very distinct opposing locations? What is the relationship between them?
So this is a really interesting way to bring in something. We've talked a little bit about Michael Levin and different forms before and things in orthogonal lab. I know Avery isn't
Up to
up to
date.
date. I haven't talked about Levin recently. So this is me bringing my own stuff into this here somewhat. But I was literally just looking at something on him from YouTube and he was sharing this. It was a short about a talk that he did months ago. And it's what I'm showing on screen now. There's something between the context of Levin talking about unconventional embodiments of consciousness, diverse intelligence research programs. For a very long time, I've been a fan of his work and the ethical implication he puts his websites for his labs research page. He concludes the whole section with his commentary on we need to continue to be aware of our, I'm quoting his research page here. All this work is being synthesized towards a framework for understanding and relating to, whether by communication or control, kind of cybernetics theme reference, truly diverse intelligences, a project that has implications not only for evolutionary biology and some perhaps exobiology, but also for the development of ethical/social frameworks that will become essential in the future as the forms of agents around us diversify far beyond what is currently imaginable. So this is from like years ago. And the most recent thing that I saw was there was a short that I saw today that was talking about his 7 months ago presentation on the diverse intelligence research program. And what he kind of, I wish I could find it. He was basically getting at something else besides just physics and biology and also generic history that is shaping the space in which things comes up in. It's a really hot, popular topic right now. And I know people like Elon Barinholtz who are really looking at fascinated with LLMs because they're talking, Elon sees LLMs as revealing something very particular about the structure of language. And he's not trying to say, or at least I don't want to represent him in the wrong way. He's fascinated with LLMs as what they imply about language and differentiating that from consciousness necessarily or embodiment. And I think between what Ari just said Levin and also the person we mentioned earlier, Maggie Vale, and many other people in the space, but we're basically looking at how are these, are there kind of structures or these sort of, as Levin was kind of getting at, he says on the slide here, yes, Platonist mathematics discovering non-inventing patterns that are dependent on constants of physics, but have causal influence in physics, constraints, and biology enablements. So sort of like, are there sort of these core, you may call them aspects of information or aspects of dealing with how things are processed? Is there something there? And we don't have to go back into 11 stuff right now. I kind of want to come back to you directly, Avery. So when you're saying, how do these I don't know if these are the best words that I wrote down. How do these vectors or mechanisms or these lopsidedness form? Like, can you say a little bit more about like, what do you think? I assume this is sort of an allusion to our past knowledge histories of other theories and whatnot, but like, how do you see, what kind of axes do you see? Or like, can you say a bit more about?
I think some of the like what kind of stimulations people see can be pretty easy to look into. I think, but those aren't necessarily like opposites in the way that people might expect. I think that something more like things that are more polarized and do reflect the personalities of existing AI agents. Like people describe, I think Claude is more dry than Gemini, and Claude is actually better at debugging for that reason. Looking at like, are those like, are some things that I think are more structurally lopsided and specialized in processing, are those actually represented as holding opposite spaces? What kind, and if you zoom back and try, and I have a few ideas for how to like integrate different personality traits into a more structural view that's more compatible with stuff like phenomenology and body and cognition. How are things that are traits that are more likely to be lopsidedly processed actually in there's mathematical terms I'm rusting on, but like in polarized opposite spaces. And can you create some kind of map of opposite traits and what kind of, and can I create interesting visualizations of opposite space traits within either a LLM or like different LLMs models?
Yes.
And then the thing after that is like, if there isn't, what is there instead? What does that show about the way that LLMs are programmed? And if there is, what are cool things we can do with that?
Yeah. And I think we're kind of getting into, in a similar way, especially in sort of the biology, neuroscience, or xenobiology or diverse intelligence sense. It was very big a while ago. They're like, oh, octopus is sort of the closest terrestrial thing we have to another form of intelligence. Or maybe we can start looking at what would intelligence look like if it was an alien intelligence. I think we're finally getting to what's exciting about this space is I think we're finally getting to the technology being accepted. And by the technology, I mostly mean language models, aspects of essentially deep learning. And I also being straight up I also just mean the user interface component, like both the technology and the user interface component of a chatbot. And as we talked about, also, as we talked about literally a few days ago in the AHA lecture series, which is the Advancing Humans with the AI lecture series, I was at the Thomas Costello AI for Shared Reality, and we had a slight set of discussions in within that. It won't even, chatbots will soon be obsolete in some form. So like moving towards these things that are parallel or relatively real time augmentations or lenses or layers about what's happening, like things that are indicating, oh, is a narrative being steered in a direction, is someone being left out. Like we mentioned a long time ago, we mentioned the unbiased.health, which was this program from my old school, and one of the labs I loosely participated was at UC San Diego, about patient provider interaction. And so how is that, in long story short, yes, it confirmed the sort of old trope of, if you're a marginalized person or a minority, your concerns will be less less tended to open as openly as if you were a more hegemonic or the sort of classic white male version. So there, and that was something that was done, across a lot of different periods of time, but getting towards these things that are much more real time and real time commentary and regulation, real time commentary, what's going on. We have all that stuff going on, but
We were talking about exploring lecture spaces, and when you started sharing about different academics who are exploring the nuances
yeah,
in human
yeah.
dynamics, feelings, and power structures.
So I was saying it's not just the LMs and not just deep learning and not just the RAGs and not just the information. It's also these user interfaces that are letting there be a lot more real time data collection, no less like biometric things as well. But the ability to look at these things that are much less abstracted out. A lot of data is collected from these very sterile, discrete, go to the lab, go to this controlled environment, test the specific thing. But the experimental aspect and then the actual ability for the creators to interface differently with the data and use the tools differently leads us to my real point. What I'm really trying to get with this whole line of thing I've said for the last 2 or 3 minutes is I think the exciting part about where we are right now is that there's never been a better time for people who really want to demarcate and explore and do the frontier mapping of these very neglected intrapersonal spaces, the nuance of individual, we have terms like neurodivergence, but the actual variety of regulatory processing people of different types of divergence or different types of neurotypicality, whatever you want to say in that space, even outside of those things, but just having much better and broader terms rather than typical or non-typical, getting into things that some of the personality theories suggest. Like now is a time where people can really start to try to put their theories into meaningful, accessible ways and get real feedback and data from it. So it's more accessible now, but it's still going to be very hard to do.